many organizations have a lot of talent, but the talent has to also want to win. And so I think part of what the job of leadership is to create a culture that says we are going to be the best.
And you can come up with any type of strategy all day long, right? Which gives you financial performance and forecast whatever you want. But if people are not on board, you ain't gonna pedal anywhere. So that's the cultural part. Understanding how people think today.
Hello there. So welcome to Ready to Transform, human-centric change enablement in the age of AI. I'm the host, Lauri Paloheimo, the head of change and co-founder at Pandatron. And here I also have my co-host Dima Syrotkin, our CEO. We will go to the guest introductions very soon because that's going to take quite a lot of time. We have very prestigious guests today. But before that, I want to contextualize a little bit on what are we going to talk about today. And that is going to be basically on why the technically brilliant AI initiatives do fail for political reasons. We are going to get deep today into how can this human factor when it comes to AI adoption be solved, the political questions, and who should be listening. I think the executives who are leading these types of transformations, middle managers implementing AI, technology leaders who are facing difficulties in getting buy-in, and if you are just interested in general of artificial intelligence and how to actually get your organization updated in that manner, this is the podcast you should be listening to. Now to our prestigious guests, we have today Jeffrey Pfeffer from Thomas D. Professor of Organizational Behavior, Stanford Graduate School of Business, who has been teaching at Stanford GSB since 1979. He's an author of 16 books, including Power, Why Some People Have It and Others Don't, Leadership BS, Fixing Workplaces and Careers One Truth at a Time, Dying for a Paycheck, How Modern Management Harms Employee Health, 7 Rules of Power, Surprising but True Advice on How to Get Things Done. And in general, he's a world-renowned expert on organizational power, leadership, and evidence-based management. Our second guest is Christian Guttmann, AI executive entrepreneur and researcher, who has built and exited AI companies valued at 650 million Swedish crowns, board member and entrepreneur, VP and AI leader at global enterprises such as Tietoevry, Pega, IBM, and British Telecom, led plus 150 AI engineers, architects, and business developers, scaled AI businesses to triple-digit revenue growth, PhD in autonomous AI agents, former professor with plus 100 invited talks, including the Royal Society of Medicine, Harvard, and SRI, and also has 60 plus publications and patents in artificial intelligence. Wow, what a setup. Welcome aboard. All right, I think we could start from the topic of power and organizational power, and especially on how it applies to AI adoption. So if we go to these fundamental concepts, Jeffrey, of your work, what would be your core concepts that you think we should start with?
Well, I think AI adoption is not that much different from the adoption of any other advanced technology. Um, there is an assumption in the world, which of course is incorrect, that if something is better, it will be adopted easily, smoothly, and quickly. And this is true whether we're talking about robotics or artificial intelligence or almost any kind of management practice. But that is, of course, not true. There is always a set of individuals who have an investment in the status quo. There's always a set of individuals who benefit from the current way the work is done and from the current arrangements. Some of them, of course, have jobs that may be at risk. Many of them have a way of working that will probably need to change, and so people like to continue doing what they're doing with what they have been doing, and people also like a regime that has made them successful. So if you're a very senior executive leader, you have come up under a certain set of assumptions and a certain set of rules and a certain set of things that have made it, that have brought you to the top, and you're not very likely to lead to want those to change. So AI in that sense is not different than anything else. Where you have entrenched interests who benefit from the status quo and therefore are going to push back when you try to change that status quo and when you try to implement something else. And so what that suggests practically is an extraordinarily simple thing to do, which almost nobody does, which is the first thing you ought to do when you put in AI or anything else is do a power map. Figure out who are the people who have who could stop the adoption, whose support you need. Figure out who they are connected to, and figure out what their interests are, and then figure out how you're going to make the adoption of AI in their best interest, because if you don't, they're not going to adopt it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Uh, Christian, like, how does this sound to you? Like, do you think like power mapping is something that we should start from?
Yeah, and I completely see, Jeffrey, I support what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense, and I see it in practice all the time. So I may just want to add a small twist to the AI world and the adoption of AI. I think one thing that might be slightly different to other tech environments or other adoptions of new technologies or changes, that it seems to be at unprecedented speed. So the speed at which AI is coming and how quickly it updates and changes seems to be much faster than what I've seen in previous waves. You know, when you look at even the .com era or so, right, it was somewhat slower. Now it's like LLMs and new waves of technology coming in. And what that means also from an executive level and from a power position, you need to act. You have this sense of FOMO on one end, investors, stakeholders, board members want things in action uh, quickly, and then you have this continued imbalance of knowledge in the organization. But very quickly, I'm completely underlining what Jeffrey said. So what I'm doing in my executive position, so when I'm leading new initiatives, which I've been doing many times, and all of them were running under the AI umbrella, is basically stakeholder mapping, which is, I think, very similar to what Jeffrey suggests. It's like, really, what do I need to do? Because this is not going to be me and the technology in my team. No, it's like a whole lot of people that need to help me to support it, or be aware of who needs to be, let's say, convinced, and to whom you need to, get the message across. What's the value to them? Why should they be part of the equation, right? So one big part, which I've always been done as part of the strategy slash culture change, is stakeholder mapping. And that means, form new relationships, get those on board that need to understand what needs to change. And I think that is practically the same, what Jeffrey hinted to.
It's exactly the same. And I would add that what Christian is really talking about is a word that my colleague Charles O'Reilly uses all the time, which is alignment. You need to get people, you need to get people aligned behind the strategy. You need to get them aligned behind the vision. If you look at a football team, whether it's American football or European football, which we call soccer, you want the team to work as a team, and that means they have to understand what the rules are. They have to understand what the game is. They have to understand how to play it. They need to understand what their objectives are. So Christian is really talking, I think, very importantly about this issue of getting people aligned behind what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
Mm.
I think another thing that might be arguably different is that with AI, it feels like we can actually automate certain white collar jobs. And to some extent that hype is, it's hype and it's overstated, but I have actually personally seen that happen. And then the question is, from perspective of power, does that create the dynamic between the employer and the employee, where the employer is motivated to automate as much as possible because it decreases the costs? Is there then that resistance towards automation? And I think, I mean, I wonder what you would think, Jeffrey, because on one hand, I would understand that you would say, well, it's the same as, RPA, for example, was kind of like older kind of software. But I feel like here, in comparison to like here, it can actually automate decision making, which is, hasn't been happening to the same extent, I feel like, and it kind of climbs like further and further ladders of the hierarchy. Versus like previously, I think the managers were mostly sort of safe from it.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I mean, we're certainly automating a bunch of things, but one of the things that I also advocate, and I'd be interested to get Christian's reaction to this, we have in a lot of software, and you see this. I know this well because I have a very dear friend that used to run Stanford Healthcare, which is our hospital, and you can see this with doctors. Physicians are burned out, and physicians are burned out all over the world, and so he and I came up with this idea, which is an interesting idea. It's like almost an obvious idea. If I said to you, I'm going to build a product and I'm going to build this product without talking to the customer, you would say you're nuts because now we have customer centered product design. But we build tools where we do not consult at all or take into account at all the work processes of the people doing the work. And so, just as you need customer centered product design, you need employee centered tool design so that you build decision aids, you build software tools, you build, for that matter, robots, you build equipment, physical equipment that is organized around how the people do their jobs, and you involve them in that actual design process. I mean, if you go back, and I understand everybody believes artificial intelligence is different, but if you look at the evolution of mechanical tools like saws and drills and power saws and chainsaws, a lot of that advance has been around how do I put in guards so you don't chop your fingers off? How do I make it easier for you to do the planing and the whatever that you're trying to do to the wood or the metal, whatever you're trying to do? And I think in very much the same way, we need to figure out how we can use software to make people more, not only replace them and reduce costs, but also to make them more effective. How do I make you a better doctor? Not how do I replace you with some robot?
Yeah, I exactly. And so I happen to know the area of healthcare very well. I'm now at the Karolinska Institute. I built companies in healthcare, so I'm very familiar with it. And hey, we go back to the main proposition, the main thesis, right? Stakeholders. Who's the stakeholder here? The users of the system, right? If you build a system where the users are not part of it, I think you're running a big risk. So, and I think especially in healthcare, regrettably, it's one of those areas, one of those industries where the path is laid with tombstones or bad examples, where new technology comes in and it doesn't work, and doctors basically they just want a tool which makes their lives easier, right? Like I remember I wasn't so active back then business wise, but Windows 95 or so, right? I mean, there was a whole wave of doctors around the world which tried to just switch on the computer and it didn't even work, right? That's one of those classical examples. But in terms of, and there's also large companies. I work for some of them, some of the large, biggest, like Big Blue, right? The primary focus, and this goes also back to the stakeholders who's buying the system, right, and who's using the system. Often completely different entities, right? And so, and those that are buying it, CIOs, other parts of the organization, they're not necessarily their primary concern, and their primary KPI is not necessarily how well the tool works. In my practice, whenever I introduce a product or when I introduce a service within the organization or as something that goes to the market, I think these tests with users are absolutely key. Like it's usually both. It's the users of the system and the customers that pay for the product. Both of them are primary stakeholders. There's obviously many, many more, right? And employees are clearly, I agree completely with Jeffrey here. Yes, certain tasks in jobs will be replaced, but I think what the real if your mindset is towards looking at humans as those that can use tools, and then you can increase their capacity of working effectively and efficiently with AI, then you're on the winning streak rather than thinking, oh, how many can I replace, like blunt out. It's seldom that that's actually the case. Thinking differently and think, okay, how can I take this job position and make it a 5x, efficiency gainer by making their lives easier, then you're on the right thought process. That's a little bit that's my take, and I think that's an extension of what Jeffrey hinted at here too.
Absolutely.
I'm actually curious at this point before we move forward with the agenda. Based on your work with working with stakeholders or your understanding of power and influence, when it comes to leading change, what do you think people leading change misunderstand about the nature of power and influence, or don't understand at all?
Well, I think the follow up was really was what Christian said. Um, I didn't know we were going to be in such wonderful agreement, but I should have guessed that because if you put smart people together, they're probably going to see the world in a very similar fashion. I think people don't think about this aspect at all. It's not that what they misunderstand. They don't take it into account. So when people put tools in, you need to design the tools with the users in mind, and you need to make sure that the users actually know how to use the tools, and you need to make sure that the tools make the users' jobs better and more effective and more efficient and take out unnecessary burdens. And I think, to go back to Christian's, comment, which I think is exactly right. Oftentimes, particularly in healthcare, people put stuff in that make people's jobs harder. They made their jobs worse, which is why there is so much burnout and so much resistance. So I think you begin by having a focus on the user, just as you begin product design by having a focus on the user. At Stanford, we have the Hasso-Plattner design D school. I did a case on a guy named Zia Yusuf, and I got the privilege of interviewing Hasso-Plattner. And Hasso-Plattner, after I did this long interview with him, they thought I'd kidnapped him, and we spent so much time together. He said to me, I am still trying to get my engineers at SAP to, when they design software, to design it from the perspective of the people who are going to use the software. And he said, I can't get them to, he said, you're an expert on power. Tell me what I should do. I'm Hasso-Plattner, this technological visionary. He was at the moment the CEO of SAP. He says, I cannot get software engineers to design software from the perspective of the user. So I think it is really as simple as perspective taking.
We spoke earlier before we joined the call, right? I'm here in Stockholm in Sweden. You might come over here, Jeffrey. So if Plattner at the end of this session, when he felt imprisoned, liked you very much, then it's actually called the Stockholm syndrome, right? So which you might have heard of. So, but yeah, I wanted to add a nuance to the idea of having the users in focus, in a sense that there's also famously many leaders that suggested, like Ford, for example, if you ask people what they want, they tell you faster horses. So there's also moments where you need to, I think, appreciate when users and stakeholders may not fully comprehend what's possible, right? And so that may also be a case here, and that has been the case in previous waves of technologies, right? In .com, I remember I was speaking to many music companies, right, back then, and they certainly did not understand what peer-to-peer networks were, how internet worked. Websites just came about, so there were a whole lot of industry being very ignorant about what's technological possible. And in many ways, that's very similar now. There is a slight danger that sort of more artificial knowledge about AI comes in, and that, of course, guides wrong decision making. So one emphasis that I often try to highlight is, make sure as a leader of a business or main stakeholders that you have access to proper expertise so that you can make powerful decisions which are grounded in truth and knowledge, right? Because AI is not a phenomenon of recent years. It is a research area, and especially at Stanford, which has been around for decades. So, drawing from that knowledge, I think is extremely important. And that goes back then, asking yourself, when it comes to stakeholder management, when to involve different stakeholders, at what time, and what do you tell them? So it's not necessary that everyone sits around the table all the time, which I, by the way, did also in some projects, and that also didn't work, right? Because you had all the stakeholders around the table, and that didn't work either. So you have to be very fine-tuned, whom you involve at what time, what what type of information is relevant to people, and how do you sort of shape the business and the product forward?
When we talked about this replacement or enablement, if I think about our own product, so Pandatron is we think of ourselves as an extension of a change management or transformation manager. And we sort of build an AI for them that helps them to it talks to every employee, and so it acts as their extension, and then it brings the intelligence back from those conversations. So it both supports the employees and then brings the intelligence back on, like, hey, here's what's going on, here's what you need to do. But then often sometimes people get threatened when they hear what we do, when they're like, the transformation managers, change managers, and I actually really don't think they should, because if you think about it, if we were only doing what we do, it would be not really that good, because you're missing the whole kind of top-down approach. You're missing the strategist that thinks about, which stakeholders to involve, when, where, who creates the plan. We kind of have this bottom-up, motion, and so it almost feels like 1 plus 1 equals, more than two. And I think that this is one of those cases where AI really enriches things, and it's really not about automation per se. It's really about like what new possibilities it opens that were never there before.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And to piggyback on that, I liked Christian's idea on that there needs to be this understanding of what is possible. But I think in addition to that, there is also needs to be understanding of what is desirable, because I think many people still consider AI as a form of entertainment or something that is just reserved to the weird tech people in their chambers, and therefore people don't have the proper imagination in place on what can you even do, what is valuable, what problems this could be solving, which is why we see, for example, that coaching is an excellent approach for resolving that, mainly from the standpoint that you need to provide people the space to think about uh, how do they want to use AI to augment their abilities, how they want to produce something that is aligned with their sense of identity, who they want to grow as people and professionals, what kind of values they want to affirm, what kind of needs they want to fulfill, and also what are the boring things that they want to get rid of. But that is just one aspect of the story. And I think sometimes we are still left in this 2010 AI imagination where we think about the more rudimentary machine learning. But now we are really at the brink of a completely new era, where I actually do think that there is a very prevalent need for shifting our attention not just from what should be done, but also what could be done, and making that something that is joyful and aspirational. To come back to the question of power and influence, I think it's an interesting question that how can we actually, or you working there in the change trenches, uh, get people to act on and just trying out AI for different purposes? How can you, in a sense, make it something that is contagious within the organization itself? So it's not just done by specific people who already have a proclivity for technical adoption, but especially the people who might not have that.
Well, I don't know if Christian probably better equipped to answer that than I am. But many years ago, we have, of course, there was a guy named Deming who was the progenitor of the quality movement, and he had a motto which I think we have forgotten, which is the first thing you need to do when you embark upon a quality improvement project or a productivity improvement project, or for that matter, any other project, is drive fear out of the organization. And certainly Amy Edmondson at Harvard has been very much along that line as well. I think people do not respond well when they are afraid.
Yes.
I think fear causes people to be rigid. to engage in all kinds of counterproductive behavior. And so, I think Deming was right. The first thing you need to do with any change effort, including implementing AI, is to make sure that that your organization has as little fear in it as possible. And I
Mhm.
see Dima nodding his head in agreement. So to me, that is, I think, one of one of the big mistakes we now have, particularly with my friends in the Silicon Valley, organizations that are filled with fear. I mean, my colleagues in the Silicon Valley don't even know how to do layoffs. So, Meta will announce a layoff of 10,000 people, but they won't tell you which 10,000. So, of the 100,000 Meta people, we don't have 10,000 people who are afraid. Everybody's afraid because nobody knows who it's going to be. So we have really perfected the idea of making organizations scared as hell, which is not a good way to get any kind of change, including AI change in.
I honestly feel that's the core. And actually, just to build upon that, I think that that is also what makes AI different. I'm curious if Christian agrees, but I feel like maybe because of like Hollywood, but also because it is so powerful and because it comes so fast, right? Which is related to to it being powerful. I feel like it really induces fear in people because they're like, okay, this thing is alien, this thing is, threatening me. Um, yeah, like Christian, I'm curious if you've seen that and like do you have any case studies for us to like I mean you've been a VP of AI like for way
Yeah,
longer than LLMs
yeah,
even emerged and it's I
yeah,
think it's still
yeah,
part of the same trend even though people only look at the past 2 years as like AI, but AI has been there
yeah,
for a
for
while.
sure. Hey, yeah, for sure. And then I'm just thinking, I'm reflecting over the many keynotes and many events I've been at and panels and where we discussed those moments. But I also remember when I was the global head of AI and data at Tieto in Finland, it became very, and that was maybe 5 years ago when I started having these discussions. There were many people when we had our company summer parties and so on, right? So people we came together, and I remember that many people in the organization came to me, and many engineers, many technical people, they were literally very concerned. You could feel that they were deeply concerned about how the future will look like, how their job would look like. And I was actually a little bit almost overwhelmed because I didn't expect that this more social environment to have so many people approach me in this casual setting. And I could deeply feel they were literally thinking a lot of huge changes will happen. And of course they are happening. Then I'm seeing also here a cultural dimension, right? So Jeffrey is in the US, and I'm assuming you are American, I guess, right? Lived in the US for all your life. And then we have different cultures, here in the Nordics. And Jeffrey, I don't know how many times you have been here, but there is generally a more dynamic environment in the US, right? When it comes to jobs, the unions are strong here in the Nordics, right? I mean, many know the case with Tesla and so on, right? Where there's a big clinch between the union here in Sweden and Elon Musk, and people there's a different sense of protection. I tend to think that changes mean opportunity, and that means you can open. But of course, I'm biased. I'm someone who has always been open-minded and changes. So I very much appreciate many others that have families, that have a rhythm, that have learned things. Right, the old world where you had you have done your degree, you have done your education, and then you exercise that knowledge in a business for the rest of your career. Right, and so we're moving more and more away from that sort of world. You need to continuously sort of learn and adapt. I think it's very hard to have a job and stay and do exactly the same for the rest of your life. So that's certainly one aspect. And I think this is also super relevant for the leaders in organization and business leaders in organization, which often have the most power. It's the CEOs, the CXOs, the board members, right? They are the very powerful ones. And I'm encouraging often then i- i- to make sure that change is celebrated in some sense, right? So those events in the organization which work well, where people are enthusiastic and where you are, where they use AI, right? Like bring this out, highlight this as something that has been a real success. It doesn't have to be a massive change in the organization, right? But it needs to be something that displays and shows how employees took initiative and turned this into something that has been valuable and has been fun. right? And so the technology is not scary, change is not scary. And I think that is a very powerful way of bringing new technologies forward. And there's, of course, many, right? So I'm just mentioning one. I mean, there's everything from hackathons and technologies. What I'm not such a big fan of is like mandatory things. So what happened over the last year, some of you know, there's several companies who said, yep, who hasn't used ChatGPT or used any other LLM, right? Or the version that they have in their own company, we monitor if you haven't used it, right? And you will be in trouble. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing. So I think you can do much better as a leader, to use your power in making change possible in an organization.
Just a quick follow up on what Christian said. One of our clients from SAP actually said that like people change when they see others succeed. I think we're also very mimetic creatures, and so just to like confirm what you said, right, and that like celebration of change, I think honestly is like one of the big most powerful things. So we currently are working on this like AI that like supports people, and then like okay, it kind of provides the intelligence to the management. I'm constantly thinking as like a CEO and sort of product owner, okay, how can we have the social element there too of like people sharing or helping each other, or I think that is so important because also like if you look at like Greek sort of ancient Greek practice, it's like it's more about the practice than it is about sort of the school per se or whatever. It's all about creating that
Mm,
space. Um,
mm, mm. And also, if I may add, there's another dimension which I would be interested to hear also Jeffrey's point on, which has a lot to do with power. So I think it's really proximity. I would put it under the umbrella of proximity. It's like the proximity both of the successes, meaning how close are you, how often are you exposed to it. So sort of the frequency of seeing and knowing and meeting the people that are implementing this technology. And personally, another little, I don't really want to call it case study, but what do you want to call it? Did I make a mistake? I don't know, but I have chosen sometimes leadership positions where I was away from my peers. I was away from the CEO. They were not in the same town. They were in another town on another continent. All my teams, they were everywhere else but in the country where I was. And also the main customers, they were not in the country where I was. So everything was away from me. And these corridor talks, the meetings that you have to have with key people, key stakeholders, the key people in your own team, the vice presidents and the CEO and the board members, right? If you don't see them physical and more casual environments, and you sort of share the successes, I think that's very, very important. And I think that's the same importance for new technology. You need to be where these things happen.
Well, I think you want to be close, and a lot of that is because not only the unplanned interactions, which are so important. But it's also you build up to the extent that you see people and you share experiences with them and you share jokes with them and you share maybe even a meal with them. Over time, you build a certain amount of social capital or social bond, and that permits you to get through tough times. I can tell you, as I think about my own work environment, I mean, Stanford is as our colleagues now live throughout the Bay Area, which is of course a large area, and we see each other less. And I think post COVID, fewer people come to the office every day. We have a nice office; nobody's ever there. I think there is not the same reservoir of goodwill. And so I think what Christian is really talking about is building up a certain kind of goodwill and understanding and camaraderie, or call it what you will, from being together and interacting. And when that is gone, then I think it's much harder to drive change, or for that matter, to go back to a word that I used earlier, to create alignment.
Mm.
It's much easier to create alignment when people are co-located, at least occasionally. Yeah, and
and
trust.
trust, right,
And
goes
trust.
back to
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I've been trying to formulate like the what is the at the crux here, and to me it seems that this alignment happens when AI is not perceived as overpowering but empowering, and then that kind of comes back to this question of how do we shift this perception from AI being something that is overpowering, something that is threatening, to something that actually is liberating and value creating and something you shouldn't be afraid of. And I think there is this big of a need of us, especially leaders in the organizations, making sure people don't feel that they are playing zero sum games with the AIs where they are on the losing side, and seeing the organizations as these closed boxes with limited operations that if you implement too much technology, then you're out. But instead, there should be this understanding that, okay, automation can and will and should happen, but you can always move forward to something more meaningful. Um, and that is a big shift, I think, that demands this certain level of trust and psychological safety as well as the other part of the coin.
I mean, I'm thinking, I'm also challenging, as Jeffrey said before, hey, we were all in agreement. So I'm trying to actively find something where we can rub against each other a little bit. So I'm just like thinking, alignment is important. I agree. And yes, you want to create a space where people are, where they sort of safe. But at the same time, especially as a leader, you need to also recognize where alignment itself is maybe not enough. I'm now thinking, and I think Jeffrey here is also, that's your field of academic expertise. Like when you look at political leaders, right? There's a time where you want to align as many interests and parties as possible, but there are also times where you need to really clearly say where the direction is going, and that may
Yes.
mean that you sort of disrupt, right? I mean, here in Europe, perhaps one of the closest figures right now is Macron. He would often take the first step, right? He would invite all the other leaders. Hey, I have an idea, come over, right? So he would be more disruptive, and he's regarded as that. But you wouldn't call that like straight book alignment, right? You would try to create more friction in that sense. And similarly, also, I think as a leader in an enterprise, in a large enterprise in particular, I've certainly often had to make decisions and understand, well, when is it not enough to bring everyone on board all the time, right? Sometimes the speed or the change needs to be abrupt. And I think, Jeffrey, you pointed to one thing already, right? You have a large organization, and now you, as a leader, you're facing the challenge. All right, how do I fire 10% of the workforce, right? I mean, I think that's what you mentioned, if I understood you correct. Then, of course, these are very abrupt moments, right? It's you can, of course, do that very well too, uh, but then you need to start, thinking how you do that in a good way. So just throwing in something here, maybe
Yeah.
I still see you
And
nodding.
maybe that's okay, right? Maybe that's okay to fire some people because,
Yeah.
um, because otherwise, what's the opposite? Is that stagnation?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
a good goal? Yeah. Jeffrey, what do you think about that? I think it's a very valid point that Christian raised, and the role of leadership. I guess that's the question, right?
One of the things that I have seen occur in organizations, actually, including actually Stanford Healthcare prior to Amir Rubin arriving, or Xerox many, many years ago, is to have organizations where people thought not very good performance was nonetheless okay. If you think about, yeah, many organizations have a lot of talent, but the talent has to also want to win. And so I think part of what the job of leadership is to create a culture that says we are going to be the best.
And then my little addition to that one is, you all know the saying, culture eats a strategy for breakfast, right? I don't know if you heard it, but that's one of those things where you're also very responsible for making sure that people understand what you want to achieve. And you can come up
That's
with any type of strategy all day long, right? Which gives you financial performance and forecast whatever you want. But if people are not on board, you ain't gonna pedal anywhere. So that's the cultural part. Understanding how people think today, and then get them on board.
Yeah, exactly, and that's precisely like what we intend to do with
Mm.
the artificial intelligence that we are providing, because in a sense we do see that uh, there is only so far that where we can go with showing one PowerPoint presentation to the whole company and then expecting that some kind of a miracle will happen. No, people actually need to actively reflect on what this means. People need to actually reflect on what this means for me, like on a frequent recurring basis, because unfortunately that's not something that an AI can tell us. That is something that an AI can help us figure out. But because it is a process of implementation and integration, it means we need to actively participate and not be lazy about it. And that's where we, in a sense, in a bit ironic way, can use artificial intelligences for people to use more artificial intelligences, which might be the future of the work life where it is heading. Then comes this question, in a sense, that how can we position these new AI technologies as this kind of a new resource that is more enhancing than threatening? And in a sense, especially when we think of the status quo and existing structures, that there is not that big of a loss, or that sense of a loss might be exaggerated.
I'm not obviously nearly as an expert as you two are on this, but my sense is that one of the things that the Pandatron product does is it makes communication faster, easier, and more frequent. So that if so one of the things that AI can certainly do is remind people and communicate with people more than a human being can. So if I have 20 or 30 employees, how often am I going to be able to talk to them? How often am I going to be able to engage with them? And how often, therefore, am I going to be able to deliver a message around what I expect of them, and this whole issue of alignment? I mean, Jack Welch is famous for saying that culture. What you had to do at GE, the culture and culture change was relentless and boring, and that it need to be repeated, and that the messages need to be repeated. And so one of the things that AI can certainly do is have information go to people on a more regular basis, and to engage with people more frequently, and maybe even more substantively than a leader can, who is only going to be able to see those people on a very occasional basis. But I would never would put myself in the position of trying to describe what would you do better than you do. So I would let you try to describe to.
20 is okay, but if you think about like the CEO of Panasonic that we are working with, and he has to deal with 230,000.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a bigger. I have like now 20 in Pandatron. That's a little bit easier. but but when you get to like thousands, that's when yeah. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think communication is one key. I think the other key is also like when you said, why don't they build a power map, for example. You could discuss about this kind of power intelligence. Can we sort of decentralize that intelligence so everyone is nudged to do that rather than it being only kind of this top skill that comes from top down.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, exactly. Like you can go even wild with it when you think of the future, and in a sense have the AI uh, work as this decentralized intelligence that is able to draw mental models of all the employees in the organization, in a sense seeing that, going to the platinum rule, that how they want to be treated, how they want to be engaged, how they want to be empowered, basically to participate to the change, and be constantly reminded of the fact that they have a choice every day. And that's how would I say, I think, mm, when it comes to the fundamental mission of what we are trying to achieve here, is this uh, idea that AI can actually be an activating agent and not just passivizing. AI can actually help us think, and remind that we have choice on the important matters.
Mm. I mean, there's one case. We built an agent system, a multi-agent AI system in Australia for chronic disease management, right? Going to healthcare and applying AI there. So as you know, I guess, right? When you have a chronic disease, say diabetes, is super complex, right? Any chronic disease is very complex, and what we built is basically an AI agent system which would have the role of looking at the care team, the family, the friends, the patient, to overlook the entire care plan. Because what's known is if patients follow and adhere to care plan, they will become much more healthy, right? That's established. If you follow the rules by the doctors, if you like, and the care plan, you will be good. But 80 or 90% don't follow that plan, right? Because it's busy, it's complex. So we built an AI agent system that was already 10, 12 years ago in Australia, which would provide support for every single actor, the GP, so the physician, the podiatrist, the optometrist, the friends, everyone would be involved. And you would do this for multiple care plans, for multiple doctors who are responsible for it. And what happens there is that you provide exactly this highly personalized advice, anything from reminders. We used fundamental concepts like transaction costs, right, which were in the 60s popular, was a Nobel Prize given for that. The point being, when do you intervene? How costly should the intervention be? And these agents would make these types of decisions then, right? So we basically rolled this out and scaled this out. And this had the effect of taking into account the preferences of individuals, right? Like if the physicians would say, oh, I don't want to have like meetings after 4 p.m. because I have certain things, you take that into account for the entire care plan execution, which is highly distributed, sometimes across Australia, and very, very dynamic. Because I mean, business rules might change, compliance might change, patients get sick tomorrow. Very, very dynamic. And so the idea is in principle something very similar, which is sort of a coach or supporting agent that allows you to construct that very highly dynamic environment and keep everyone aligned and make sure that one of the primary goals is to keep the patient on track to basically reverse diabetes, because it's highly reversible, right? If you take the right actions. And it's of course one of the driving costs in any country, certainly also the US, but any Western country, actually any country for that matter.
That was a very, very inspiring example. And I think like what you were talking about and what we were talking about is something that could be called these AI agents that enable systems intelligence in organizations, because there is just so much decisions, so much noise constantly, that it is very easy for people to keep on stuck in a rut and not like seeing the big picture. And that's precisely where the AI should help us. They should help us to take a step back in our own personal lives and even in, I guess, whole organizations, and allowing us the space to ask, what the heck are we doing? Are we doing the right things or are we not doing the right things? And if they provide us that, they, I think, do provide us value that is just not possible without these kinds of technologies. And I seriously think, considering the amount of complexity we have in our societies, that we need these types of tools in order to adapt into these situations we have.
The tool that you want to build, that you look at, I'm thinking and weaving it into Jeffrey's power maps and the stakeholder maps and stuff. Because I think what's also a little bit more unique now with this AI wave is that the power map or the stakeholder map now potentially includes the AI agents, right? Because you
Yes.
start giving them more power and more
Yes.
autonomy to take action in the organization, which is somewhat unprecedented, right? Epic, the company that you mentioned, Jeffrey, right? It's a basically workflow data management system, right? So it's quite passive. It's not going to make decisions for you, right? So, but an agent, the way you describe it and the way how I see the future, right? You start to place a lot of autonomy. This whole question about who's accountable is still, let's say, discussed, right? AI Act and all those things. But that means that they are sort of part of the stakeholder map, if you want it or
Mhm.
not. And then the next question is, how do you control that, right? How do you? And what I'm seeing right now, and I published a couple of posts recently, is really that many of these implementations are very naive. You just have a whole lot of agents that do all their things, but you need to coordinate them. You need to have frameworks such that these agents and these AIs are coordinated and act in the interests of what the CEO or the company would wish to achieve, right? And so that's currently done very poorly. And I think there's another 5 years where we have to really think about properly what has been done in research, and how can we sort of build that into these AI systems and maybe
Yeah.
into the power apps.
Yeah. And that's fascinating, and it also begs an ethical question as well, which is that okay, so if we have this capacity eventually to coordinate these AI agents in the power networks, and therefore uh, extend the will of one agent, be it CEO of an organization, for example, that is a tremendous amount of control that one is having, which is why in our instance, we have chosen coaching as our modus operandi, where the AI provides the space by asking questions and even giving the option of disagreeing and inquiring into why they are disagreeing with the will of the authorities, basically, which then therefore kind of becomes this roundabout communication wave between different levels of hierarchy in the organization. Uh, to me, that is like one of the ways I have seen that uh, we could prevent the otherwise inevitable dystopic path of the future of leadership. It has to be a two-way street somehow, and there I think the AI agents should be designed accordingly, because otherwise they just becomes instruments of control. If we take a couple of steps back and think about our listeners who are people responsible for leading change, helping people to adopt these AIs in a meaningful way into their workflows, what would be the takeaways for them that you genuinely would want them to understand of what is important for them to do their work properly in this change?
I think Christian and I have both talked about things that are uh, that are reasonably similar. That he called it a stakeholder map. I called it a power map. You need to have somehow a picture of the landscape. I think that's right. I think you need somehow to have some sense of alignment. What are you trying to achieve? What is your strategy? What are you trying to do? What is your basic business model? I have a friend who's now retired who's a cost accountant who said most he does not believe most companies actually know how they make money. I mean, obviously, the profit is revenues minus expenses, but many companies have a poor idea of who their most valuable customers are, and they have a poor idea of their actual expenses and where they are. So I think you need a good sense of what you're up to and why you're up to and what your source of competitive advantage is, and then I think you need to have a pretty good sense of the work process that your various that your company is involved in, and you need to understand those work processes in a great detail. I mean, many years ago, prior to 9/11, I used to send my students out to look at airlines turning around a plane. I mean, every airline is doing basically the same thing. A plane pulls up to the gate, you unload it, you basically take out the baggage, you take off the passengers, you put on new baggage, new passengers, and new catering, and the plane takes off. Southwest could do that in 20 minutes. It took United 45. And I would say to them, why does it take United more than twice as much time as Southwest Airlines? And in that simple question, you actually learned a lot. Basically, if you to go back to another example, if you use a colonoscopy as an example, I mean the processes are basically the same. And some people are much better at this. And I've learned when now select doctors, I don't ask them what their outcomes are. I ask them why their outcomes are the way they are, because many doctors are oblivious to the processes they use, and therefore their processes will never get better. So I like to have doctors who are actually quite sensitive to precisely how they achieve the results that they achieve, because that means once you understand you and then think about your work processes, I think the technical term is called process mapping. You can actually then get rid of the parts that don't add value, and you can make parts more efficient. So to me, this is not difficult. It's not very profound. It requires, I think, discipline and attention and focus. And I don't see a lot of companies that actually have any of those three, let alone all of those three. I'd be interested in Christian's reaction to that.
Yeah, maybe in addition to what you mentioned, I was thinking there's two aspects in terms of takeaways, because by and large, I agree with you, Jeffrey. Maybe there are two extra bits. One is, as we mentioned before, is the speed of change. I think it is
Yep.
extremely important for leaders to make sure they can distinguish between hype and reality, right? And for that, you need to have people that really know this stuff. Like surround yourself with people that understand this technology, because otherwise you create such an imbalance that you will be having a lot of trouble making sound decisions that are sustainable. The second one, it's that aspect. I'm thinking a little bit what makes AI different. It was the last thing that I mentioned before, like how much there's a change now, right? All we're discussing now is to start handing over a certain amount of autonomy to agents in the organization. What does that mean? What type of things are you giving AIs? What type of decisions are they making? So Tieto, when I started, we announced, or let's put it this way, it was misinterpreted by media because the announcement was taken as a board member would become an AI at Tieto. And that was 2017, right? 2017 was in the media everywhere, in the US everywhere, right? So basically, headlines: Finnish company had a board member, an AI board member, right? So naturally, this was well before the AI Act and all these types of things. People were saying, how is that even possible? How could a board member be accountable personally, right, with their own fortune, which is obviously not not particularly. How's that possible? It was misinterpreted, right? It wasn't correct. I was sort of put in charge of that project too after the announcement was made, I should say, right? So, but it is a valid question, right? Like how much power do you give to many of these processes? To what level? Because these are not passive, predictable workflow processes. They are very understandable, right? You apply for vacation, there's some procedure in the background that rattles through, and then your vacation is approved, and that's it. So very predictable, nothing strange. But if you start giving AI decision power over, like how you should run a certain strategy or which customer you should call up tomorrow and all these types of things, then that becomes a different nuance here. And I think that is something where leadership needs to think very carefully, because you start creating sort of new area of employees which are acting in a certain way. And you need to ask yourself of what level of transparency are you comfortable with here, right? How much do you hand over? Is it 50% of everything the company is doing, or is it less than that? Because I mean now, and I'm involved obviously in a lot of AI startups that I'm, advising or investing in. Many, including myself, I want them to be AI first companies, right? Meaning every single task they look at, can you actually automate that, or can you use AI for it? Which is, I think, perfectly valid to start at least thinking about. Doesn't mean you do everything. But the question is then, to what level are you comfortable doing that, right? And maybe even allowed to do it. So, but that's 2 points that I may want to throw in here in the takeaways for leaders, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Dima, you want to go?
I think my only I'll just parrot what Jeffrey actually said around psychological safety. I think fear is the key. I think if people are less afraid, then they're naturally more curious. They start exploring, they start experimenting, and the change happens. Um,
Yeah, and I think my own takeaway could end up shilling like what we are doing, especially in collaboration with Jeffrey, where we have, for example, created AI-based exercises that help organizations with AI adoption, that help people to, in a sense, understand what kind of role AI could play in their and in their organization's future, what the AI could make easier, how the AI could augment their already existing strengths and values, and in a sense, build the foundations for their future career and so on. And for that, actually, I would be making a open invitation for what we call Panatron Learning Lab community, where you will have an access for testing out all this cool new stuff, participating into the discussions when it of the development of AI. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Overall, I think this was a very profound, very interesting conversation where we tackled quite a lot of interesting, very human topics of AI, and I think this will be very valuable for many people. So, all right, Jeffrey, Christian, Dima, thank you very much for your presence. I think we can call it a day now. It's already 10 p.m. here in Finland, and I'm getting kind of tired. Good stuff.
Thanks,
Well,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice seeing you all.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Ready to Transform. If you enjoyed it, we've got more for you beyond the podcast. Join Pandatron's Learning Lab for early access to our newest AI coaching tracks, a chance to network with industry peers, and exclusive sessions with some of the world's top thought leaders. You'll find the details in the episode description. See you next time, and until then, be ready to transform.